welcome back to my channel. This week I decided to paint someone well known. Bonus points for anyone who knows in the comments who it is that I'm painting. But this always makes me want to tighten way up, especially in a portrait. But I really enjoyed making this painting. I really enjoyed how loose I was able to stay while making this piece. So I want to share with you all how I struck this balance and how you can paint expressive portraits in oil without sacrificing either the looseness or the likeness in today's video. If you are interested in mastering loose expressive portraiture and want to go even deeper in depth than I can go in this video today, I will be hosting a live webinar on Monday, September 25th. I will have a link in the description to sign up. It's going to be at 2 p.m. Eastern. And even if you're busy during that time, go ahead and sign up because you will get a link to the replay after. But if you are able to join live, this is your opportunity to ask me questions about the process of not just painting a loose portrait, but really mastering your unique style of loose, expressive portrait painting. So before you forget, make sure to check out that link in the description to save your seat. Now on to the painting at hand. I'm excited to talk with you about this portrait because this is what I do. Whether I'm painting a person or I'm painting an animal or someone's pet, I love painting portraits in a way that isn't tight or photorealistic. And let's talk about that a little bit more specifically. So the question you might have is, what do I mean by looseness? I would say as a synonym for loose here, I could describe the painting I want to make as being painterly or expressive or maybe impressionistic, but certainly bold with the brushwork. And again, I think a way that we could describe this by way of opposites would be to say that I don't want to be overly tight. I do not want to be photorealistic, but I do really want to capture the person that I am trying to paint. That way, the final product, in my opinion, is one that celebrates both the individual, the subject of the painting, as well as the act of painting itself. That's the kind of thing that makes me fall in love with what I do. And I imagine that's probably why you're here too. So let's go ahead and talk about what set me up for success in balancing looseness and likeness in this particular painting. The first thing that I think really made a significant difference for me is that I intentionally kept this to one sitting. I find whether this is something that I'm recommending for myself or my students, this suggestion makes a really significant difference. It can be a little bit uncomfortable if you aren't used to working in one sitting or painting alla prima, but it is worth putting in the practice to get comfortable with this, because when you tell yourself that you only have until you get tired for the day, which for me is typically after maybe 4 hours or something like that, I start making very different decisions. I don't really sweat the small stuff anymore, and I definitely don't want to spend my time getting too sucked into detail. And instead, I really want to make every minute of painting count. And by extension, that means making every brushstroke count. Now, one thing that really facilitates this process of being able to actually finish the painting in one sitting is to really kick off with as accurate of an initial block-in as I can possibly achieve. Now, I can do this while still being loose, and if you take a look at the block-in stage of this, where I'm just painting with some transparent oxide brown and treating it a little bit like a value study, I do have brush marks that are definitely not meant to be super literal. I have marks that run down the center line of the head. I have marks for the hair that are meant to be very wild and interesting. And I'm focusing, in an area like the eyes on the calligraphy of the mark making much more than I am focused on the individual anatomical structures like the lower lid, the iris, the pupil, the highlight, the lash line. You'll see that these things are really just loosely evoked, but nonetheless, I'm doing everything I can to put them in the correct place and then not disturb them. And on the flip side of that, as soon as I realize I've made a mistake in that drawing stage, I really want to correct it ASAP. So this stage of the painting might feel like it goes by slowly, and I think in my experience watching really masterful painters, their block-in always feels excruciatingly slow, no matter how many times I have watched that painter work, or I know to expect a slow block-in. One of the main things that I could tell myself, or one of the main critiques that I could give myself, would be to slow down even more in that block-in stage. And at this stage, I'm trying to use every tool that makes sense to use and can benefit the process. So for me personally, that doesn't mean using a grid. I find that grids really encourage painters to tighten up, especially the smaller the grid gets. But I do use like the Photoshop trick that I've demoed on this channel before to overlay my block-in onto my reference to make sure that I am actually going about getting in those major landmarks and major proportions of the face as accurately as possible. And I only let myself move on from that value stage and start blocking in color when I know that the drawing is as accurate as it can be. Now, on the topic of blocking in, one thing that I really tried to focus on throughout the creation of this portrait is I wanted my approach to be simple. I did not want to get too sucked into small shapes. I really wanted to ask myself, how can I envision the reference image that I have in as few of brushstrokes as I can get away with? And this really helped me when it came to the next area, which is only touching the problem areas of the painting. So in practice, what this looks like is that I would often step back, I would squint, and I would assess whether something seemed to read already. And if it was reading well, I wouldn't continue to noodle on that area. This is something that really bears repeating, and it's a skill that takes practice. It's not so much a decision you can just make one day as it is something that you need to constantly exercise and strengthen in your own practice. But what it looks like in practice for me is to ask myself, what is the one area of the painting that is creating the biggest obstacle for this looking like the person that I am depicting? And I think even more specifically than that, I want to ask not only what area represents the biggest problem, but what area do I most understand how to solve as accurately as possible? So I'll give you a really simple example of this. I think it could be easy for a painter who's transitioning from the block-in stage to diving into color to say, well, the biggest thing that's keeping this from looking like the reference is that I don't have any color on here. But the task of colorizing the image is not like a simple or straightforward one. And so I would probably reframe this, and instead I would be asking, okay, is there anything in the block-in itself that is creating an obstacle to this ultimately looking like my reference? You know, are my proportions slightly off? Have I misplaced one of the eyes? Are the eyes not lining up correctly with the nose and the mouth? Any of those things. And I will definitely prioritize things where I know how to solve that problem and do it accurately. Because when we're building up a painting, one thing that really, really helps, not just the accuracy, but also the looseness, is to only build on areas where you have really high confidence. Because building up a painting can almost be like playing a game of telephone, where if you're blocking in a face and your proportions are kind of close, but there's no one proportional relationship that is actually accurate, and you just keep building out the structure of the face based on an inaccurate block-in, you're gonna start to see the likeness slowly drift further and further away from the likeness that you're trying to capture, if that makes sense. And so to help mitigate this, whether we're talking about basic drawing and proportions, whether we're talking about a value structure, whether we're talking about color choices, if we can make sure that we are starting with relationships or choices that we know are accurate, we start to see less and less of that kind of telephone style drift as we develop the painting and take it to a finish. So this really harkens back to that idea of starting out with an accurate drawing, starting out with as accurate of a value structure as I can find, making sure that I'm simplifying the face into really big, simple shapes. Now, the next thing that really helped me to avoid tightening up this painting was avoiding getting sucked into small details or textures such as hair, facial hair, eyelashes. I think those are the really big ones. And you do actually see me toward the end of this painting really get tempted to play around with that facial hair texture because there's some interesting little moments of color and light. But as soon as I stepped back and I took this in, I thought, this just looks distracting. I don't think this is actually selling the idea of this person or the likeness of this person better. This is now tending towards something that is too tight, that's too photoreal. One thing that I think can actually facilitate the avoidance of this is working at an appropriate size. So the scale at which I'm working for this particular painting is 6 by 8 inches. For me, this is about the smallest I really want to be painting a face. For me, the sweet spot is something between 6 by 8 all the way to usually 11 by 14 or 12 by 16 for like a head and shoulders portrait. The litmus test for me is I do not want the face to be smaller than the size of my fist. That's usually the point where I have to work with brushes that are so small to get in the basic features that will convey that likeness that I'm just going to get too tight and too frustrated. Now, larger than 12 by 16, we run into a couple of issues. One is that if you're doing a head and shoulders portrait, that can often become larger than life size, which kind of has a more contemporary versus like classical painting feeling. But it also just takes more time and really invites us to drift into something that is more photoreal or very tight. So working on the smaller end, but still large enough that this isn't going to feel really tedious, or I don't have to break out the one hair brush, really helps me to purposefully avoid getting sucked into those really small details because there just isn't enough space for it. And then the final tip that I have on balancing looseness and likeness is having examples of portraits, both completed and in progress if you have access to them, where the artist in question who made that portrait really works in a way that is both loose and accurate. Basically, this is what I talk about when I talk about something like an art vision board. And it's also why I find it really helpful to have contemporary painters that you look up to, because oftentimes painters working today will show you the actual process of creating those images, and they will show you what their block-in looked like. We have much less access to that when it comes to historical masters of portraiture. That's not to say that examples of it don't exist, but point being, I find it really, really useful to have examples of paintings that really accomplish what you want to accomplish, and to not only see the final product in that kind of style, in that loose painterly style, but to also be able to see what it looked like to go from block-in to final on that painting. It can really give us permission to stay loose in certain areas. It can also show us how to answer certain questions, like how do I paint this eye in a way that doesn't get too tight? This was really, really helpful for me with this particular image. I will sometimes use examples of paintings I've done where I think I did a really nice job of staying loose throughout, but I will also include final products and works in progress from painters that I really look up to give me permission to really stay loose. And one other thing that you can do is you can actually prepare for the creation of a painting with something like a master copy as a warm-up. This really helps to get that looseness into muscle memory and show you exactly how loose you can get away with being while still really capturing the likeness that you're interested in. Now, these are some of my top tips for balancing looseness and likeness when it comes to portrait painting in oil. But again, if you want to do a deep dive with me and if you want the opportunity to ask me questions about this live, make sure to follow that link in the description to sign up for my live webinar on Monday. That's September 25th at 2 p.m. Eastern. All right, I can't wait to see you then, and until next time, happy painting.